Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen of the media. Welcome to yet another press conference of the People's National Congress Reform. I am hosting today's press conference. My name is Sherwin Benjamin, General Secretary of the People's National Congress Reform. And today with me in panel is the Treasurer of the People's National Congress Reform, Mr. Elson Lowe, who will be reading today's press conference.
Thank you very much. Government's poor planning threatens to leave CPL and Christmas in the dark. As we approach the season of the year, which typically puts additional stress on the nation's electricity grid, GPL statements and actions raise serious concerns about its ability to meet demand. For the company to say it is seeking an additional 60 megawatts for the Caribbean Premier League, CPL, and Christmas, when the former is already upon us, smacks of desperation and a total lack of planning. Even further, the latest company bid statements indicate that this power onboarding process will not conclude until October 17th, when new power generation will come online. Since the tournament concludes in early October, this means the GPL will miss the CPL surge in electricity demand altogether, even in the best case scenario. Sadly, Guyanese must therefore brace themselves for the possibility of power cuts during the event. This continues to be the government's legacy of chaos and brinkmanship when it comes to the management of the nation's electricity needs. Time and time again, we have been told that this solution or that one will stop the blackout crisis, but it has continued to march on. We also note that the onboarding of power has proven to be a laborious, uncoordinated process under the PUP. It took several months for the used generator sets the government bought last year to be prepared to begin working, resulting in the government missing the entire Christmas season. Given those generators were purchased around this time last year, we are concerned that any lengthy installation process may mean that once again, their promise to meet Christmas demand will be a hollow one. Similarly, the so-called power ship faced connection delays and a declared need to combat quote-unquote vultures before it could operate. Whatever the government's plans are to onboard more power, we urge them to make them public so Guyanese can have confidence that everything is being done to avoid similarly ridiculous delays. There is no excuse for such incompetence when the government surely knows in advance of the demands of the CPL and Christmas seasons. The PUP's poor planning has created and is now perpetuating a needless, preventable blackout crisis. We repeat our call for the government to ensure Guyana gets more oil revenues through more profit oil. The PNCRA PNU has noted that ExxonMobil Guyana intends to spend over US $25 billion on the development cost of its next two approved projects, Uaru and Whiptail, which are projected to commence production in 2026 and 2027, respectively. In addition, a seventh project, Hammerhead, is being pursued with first oil expected in 2029. We wish to register our profound concern with this continued high rate of development in three regards. One, our capacity as a nation to monitor, audit, investigate, and enforce standards with regards to these developments and those that are already in production. Two, the greater risk to our environment, more so against the background of the company's continued resistance to lodging complete liability insurance and the EPA and government's cavalier attitude in safeguarding our environment. And three, the fact that with continued large expenditures, cost oil will remain at 75%. Guyana's share of the pie will therefore likely stagnate at 12.5%, royalty excluded. As regards this third concern, we should recall that both Vice President Bharat Jagdeo and President of Exxon Guyana, Alistair Routledge, had indicated earlier this year that Guyana's share of revenues will increase in the very near future as the company recovers more and more of its investment. Accordingly, in our March press conference, we had called on the government to release the company's combined cash flow statement for its first 5 developments, from Liza to Uaru. We had cautioned then that, and I quote, the PUP government, in its remaining time in office during this tenure, must ensure this projection materializes to the fullest extent possible. It must therefore not rush to approve new oil projects in the Stabroek Block, which would drive up cost oil and thereby deny Guyana the chance to acquire a greater share of revenues. We repeat those calls today with more urgency. The government must explain how the Guyanese people will obtain more oil revenues in the next few years from a reduction in the company's cost oil, even as the company spends more on additional exploration, appraisal, and development. One other point that we would like to add is that we believe that we should really be building out capacity to ensure that we are able to properly assess these new development proposals and that we are in a position to, first of all, be able to say whether we are in favor, whether we think there are greater benefits and so on to additional proposals, but also so that we can propose for ourselves any adjustments or additions that should be made. We should not be in a position where we're forced only to take what it is that the company shares with us, but rather where we can do our own assessments and make our own proposals. So that building of capacity is something that we believe needs to be done. The PUP's mid-year report makes no difference to the lives of Guyanese. We in the PNCRA PNU have reviewed the mid-year report 2024 from the Ministry of Finance, which describes the performance of the economy up to June based on the 2024 national budget. As we predicted in several of our budget presentations in January, Budget 2024 will not live up to its theme, staying the course, building prosperity for all. In fact, because the economy is quote-unquote staying the course, this is the reason why it will deliver prosperity only to friends, favorites, and families of the PUP regime. For prosperity to be delivered to all requires a fundamental refocusing of national priorities based on a people-centered development philosophy. The PUP is simply not built or bent that way. Let us comment on a few aspects of Mid-Year Report 2024. The report is deafeningly silent on the progress, if any, on reducing Guyana's food import bill. As is known, Guyana has committed to the CARICOM-wide effort of reducing food imports by 25% by 2025. Guyana's role in this endeavor is twofold: A, reducing its own food imports, and B, increasing food exports to CARICOM. The mid-year report provides no update even as 2025 looms large. 2, if Guyana's real economy grew by an estimated 49.7% in the first half of this year, and if government or revenue flowed at the rate of hundreds of millions of USD a month, why can't Guyanese see a significant increase in their income? The recent teacher strike and negotiations are an example of this paradoxical situation. The government must surely have known these were the growth numbers for the first half of the year, yet they stuck to a salary increase number so anemic, teachers have been left bitterly disappointed. We reiterate that as our country grows, our people must benefit, and so we will increase teacher and other public servant salaries by an initial 35% graduated in the first year in office, followed by negotiations for further increases. 3, given the development and investment resources in the hands of the government from oil revenues, one must ask whether the non-oil economy should not be performing far better in terms of greater production, higher productivity, more value added, and wider diversification. To create a booming non-oil economy, however, would require new and wide-ranging approaches, none of which is in place on the PUP regime. For example, infrastructure spending has to be more directed towards boosting production and productivity. Access to credit has to be made easier and cheaper. Access to land has to be simplified and depoliticized. Disposable income has to be increased several times. Corruption must be tamed, and so on. None of this will occur under the inept PUP. 4, the Ministry of Finance in its report speaks of the economic and fiscal risks the economy faces. And its list of 5 such risks, however, completely ignores several major risks. That is, the tens of billions of dollars lost to corruption, poor planning, and mismanagement. The more the government spends, the more this loss escalates. For the PUP, such losses do not constitute a problem. It is part and parcel of its modus operandi. There is no evidence, for instance, that the government is responding to the recommendations of the IMF for, quote-unquote, a strong and effective public financial management system and a robust public investment management framework. In fact, the IMF has continued to make these calls, even making it a couple of months ago in their latest report. 5, the reported 12-month June 2023 to June 2024 inflation rate of 4% is a number with no meaning. It is the butt of jokes. Apart from being a Georgetown-based index, It severely undervalues food inflation. Many citizens share the view that prices of essential food items have increased around 20% since mid last year. This crisis has caused many Guyanese families to reduce the number of meals they eat as well as what they eat. Nevertheless, Vice President Jagdeo is on record as denying the existence of high inflation and the soaring cost of living. With that kind of attitude, do we want another term of the PUP? Under labor market under labor market conditions, page 67, the Ministry of Finance reports that, quote unquote, manpower studies are being undertaken to address sector-specific manpower requirements. Let us remind the nation that the PUP has undertaken no quarterly labor force survey since the third quarter of 2021, despite repeated calls from the opposition. The government must therefore explain what exactly are these quote unquote manpower studies. Brief in-house secret reports or publicly disclosed extensive labor market surveys that include unemployment figures. The government continues to talk about high unemployment, but with no data to support any high employment, but with no data to support any of its contentions. It is also, as a result of not doing surveys, unable to make any remark about the increase in wages in the country. 7. The mid-year report makes no mention of the need for any supplementary budgets. This most likely reflects the fact that the government's planning process, such as it is haphazard and spur of the moment. The PUP's mid-year report makes no difference to the lives of Guyanese. Midway through the life of the third oil budget, life in ordinary Guyanese households has not in any way become more prosperous or comfortable. On the contrary, it has become more stressful and burdensome. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lowe. Ladies and gentlemen of the media, we'll now entertain questions based on the press statement.
That is Shabal Memorandum.
Go ahead, Mr. Chabron.
Mr. Lowe, do you have a dollar value of, as regards your proposed increases for teacher salaries on the 10 periods that you mentioned?
Thank you very much, Mr. Shabral. We've previously mentioned that just through cutting out corruption, $50 billion could be made available pretty much immediately for those teacher salary increases. However, of course, as time goes on and there are additional increases, there will be additional costs that will come forward. We would note, of course, that given that the national budget is significantly in excess of $1 trillion, there's quite a lot of fiscal space. What we intend to do, however, is to ensure that through realizing efficiencies, whether that is in better management, whether that is in cutting out corruption, we will be able to easily afford these amounts. But nonetheless, our priorities are, of course, ensuring that people are fairly compensated and improving productivity in the public sector through training and so on and so forth.
I don't think you answered the question. What I'm trying to figure out from you is that what will be the dollar value of the increases? I'm not talking about how much money will become available by way of cutting waste, etc. How much, for instance, will be a 35% increase? What will be the dollar value of that per annum?
Yes, we previously mentioned that it would be $50 billion. That would be the amount that we would put aside for that 35% increase. Of course, it's a graduated increase, so it's not going to be a uniform increase, which has been our practice all along. However, for future increases, as we mentioned, we need to engage in negotiations with the unions, and so obviously it would be after we've engaged in some negotiations that we'd have a final figure on that. So that would give you a sense of it.
And do you have a percentage impact this may have on inflation?
As we have previously remarked, when there have been large salary increases, and we've looked at some of the sizes, 35%, 25%, those historically have been some of the larger salary increases. You've not seen inflationary pressures, as has been remarked by some individuals. We would also point out that you've seen in Guyana the national budget, become triple in only a few years, and the government claims that there is no inflation. So clearly, if you're going to be expanding the national budget, there's some room. And the government's claims that inflation only occurs when public servants receive salary increases is, I think, patently false.
So are you saying that the proposed increases will not have an inflationary impact?
We believe
No movement at all in inflation?
We believe that the impact will be a minimal impact, and that any such impact will not be a significant burden on the economy. Given the evidence of previous large increases, you will also observe that in the 2015 to 2020 period, we had a 77% increase in public servant salaries on the low level, which of course, as economists would point out, that those on the lower end of the income scale spend a greater share of their income. They consume quite a lot of it. They don't save as much. So therefore, that money made its way into the economy, and you didn't see significant inflationary pressures. We also want to point out that Guyana's economy is a productive economy. That is to say, the economy is growing, we're receiving revenues. So this is not to say that salary increases are being made in a vacuum, but that we have to look at our economy and try to, as much as we can, match the improvements in the wealth of the country with better salaries for the people who are the ultimate owners of that wealth. And so if you're seeing in the half-year report already nearly 50% growth, that again would imply that the country's revenue base is growing and that there's more space for these types of increases going forward.
You said you don't envisage a significant increase in inflation, but what is your actual forecast in terms of numbers?
That will depend a bit on the circumstances at that particular point in time. But what we're saying is that our expectation is that it would be negligible. It's not a meaningful figure. Of course, if there's some specific area that we need to look at, which is circumstance dependent, we'll look at that. But it shouldn't be a meaningful figure.
You're comparing, and this probably is my last question in this area, depending on what you say. You're comparing expenditures in wages and salaries with expenditures and things like infrastructure. But are you taking into consideration that one is recurrent while another is not recurrent?
Thank you again for your question. One of the things that we really want to make sure that there's a myth that we need to dispel. And that myth is that paying public servants, which includes nurses, teachers, joint services, we need to dispel the myth that that is not also in its own way an investment in the growth of the economy, an investment that we need to keep going. One of the things that we talk at length about is the need to accumulate human capital. That, of course, increases productivity. So spending money to give teachers a good salary so that they are motivated and living comfortably is an investment in our economy, as well as a direct investment in improving the lives of those public servants. So we want to park that argument for one. And of course, I can make the argument regarding nurses, I can make the argument regarding police officers, I can make the argument regarding staff at the GRA, and we can go on and so forth. So we want to, first of all, park that argument. The second thing that we want to mention is that it is not that the government makes a public infrastructure investments and then ceases to make any further investments in public infrastructure. They have a recurring approach of investing very heavily in infrastructure. So duly, you'll see money pumped into the economy again, which of course could have an inflationary effect. So it is, I think, not a correct comparison to say that the public servant salaries, are a recurring expense which should be viewed as just an expense, and B, that you're not going to see a recurring infrastructure expense. The last point I want to make is a really significant one. What we've observed in Guyana is that roads and bridges are crumbling almost the moment that they're built. In fact, the day after the Shona to Crane Highway was completed, we saw reports, or I think 2 days after, of it crumbling. We've seen also that the Thomas Lands Road has had to be rebuilt multiple times. You've seen the Grove Road be rebuilt multiple times. It is a false assumption that once the PUP builds a road, that road is here to stay. There is a recurring cost that is going to be featured on each and every one of these poorly implemented, poorly designed, and many of them are corrupt infrastructure projects, and that must be accounted for. In fact, that means that a lot of these projects are going to be expenses that we, when in office, will have to spend a lot of time and energy and money really dealing with. It is unfortunate, but that is the reality. And so it is, again, a totally false thing to say that once the PUP has built a road, that's the end of that expense. There are going to be persistent expenses incurred in maintaining and repairing these poor works.
I'm not pegging my questions on the basis of what any political party said. I'm pretty much relying on positions that have been taken by the Caribbean Development Bank, which has urged member states to be wary of large increases as these can cause inflation. So my next question to you really, are you in any way ignoring what the economists and the CDB say about the impact that large increases may have on inflation?
Thank you very much for your question again. As you would note, there is no comparison whatsoever between the growth rate of Guyana and the growth rate of the other Caribbean countries. In fact, you will of course note that Guyana's budget has also increased at a rapid rate, which is pretty much unforeseen, which is pretty much something you haven't seen in the Caribbean. I would also ask you to take a step back. There are very few countries in the history of the world that have grown this quickly. It's not reasonable to compare Guyana to Caribbean peers in that way. I think that's another comparison that has to be put aside because it is almost absurd. Guyana is in the first half growing something like 10 years worth of growth of a robust Caribbean economy, and that's in half of a year. So I don't think that's realistic. And also we should note that this is not the first year that we've seen this growth. Guyana has grown at a rate faster than every other country, or the second fastest rate in the entire world, for multiple years. It's not realistic to make that comparison, as much as we respect the opinion of those economists. I'm sure that if they looked at the Guyana situation, they would have different analysis, and that, I think, is the way to look at it.
Any other questions? Okay, if there are no other questions, I would like to thank you, ladies and gentlemen of the media, for attending this press conference. And I must also thank Mr. Elson Lowe, my panelists. Thank you.